I've always admired Victoria. It wasn't just her sharp intellect or the way she carried herself with effortless confidence. It was the way she could command a room without raising her voice, the way her presence seemed to shape the very air around her. She was magnetic, the kind of woman who made you want to rise to her level, to prove yourself worthy of her attention. I told myself that's all it was: admiration, respect, maybe even awe. But deep down I knew it was more. The way my pulse quickened whenever she addressed me directly, the flutter of anticipation in my chest whenever she walked past my desk, it was undeniable. I just never thought she noticed. That's why, when her message pinged on my phone late that evening, "Meet me in my office after hours," my heart skipped a beat. My mind raced, searching for reasons why she might want to see me alone so late. Had I done something wrong? Was it about my latest project? But beneath the nerves there was something else. A pull I couldn't resist, a spark of intrigue that made it impossible to say no. The office was eerily quiet as I made my way through the halls. Most of the lights had been dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs overhead was the only sound, apart from the soft echo of my heels on the polished tiles. My chest tightened with each step closer to her door, the air thick with anticipation and something I couldn't quite name. I paused in front of her office, taking a deep breath before reaching for the handle. My hand felt clammy against the cool metal and I cursed myself for being so affected. This was just a meeting, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I opened the door and stepped inside, I realized how wrong I was. She was standing by her desk, one hip resting casually against the edge, her arms crossed loosely in front of her. The faint glow of a desk lamp illuminated her figure, casting soft shadows across her sharp features. She was still dressed impeccably in her tailored blazer and pencil skirt, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun that only emphasized the sharp line of her jaw. Her eyes, though, those piercing blue eyes, were locked on me the moment I entered, their intensity stealing the breath from my lungs. "Close the door," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying an authority that left no room for hesitation. I obeyed, the soft click of the door falling into place behind me feeling final, almost too loud in the silence. I turned back to face her, suddenly hyper-aware of how small I felt in her presence. Her gaze didn't waver and the weight of it sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. I felt my palms growing clammy, my pulse pounding in my ears as I waited for her to explain why I was here. But Victoria didn't seem in any hurry. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Do you know why I called you here tonight?" she finally asked, her tone measured, almost conversational. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "No, ma'am," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ma'am," she repeated, her tone laced with amusement. "You always were polite." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to say or do. Victoria pushed off the desk, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. The soft click of her heels against the floor echoed in the silence, each step making my heart race faster. "I've been watching you," she said, her voice steady and calm as though she were discussing something mundane. But there was something in her tone, a subtle undercurrent that made my stomach twist. "Your work. Your dedication. It hasn't gone unnoticed." Her words should have filled me with pride, but instead they left me feeling exposed, like she could see straight through me. My cheeks burned and I lowered my gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond immediately. When I dared to glance up, she was closer now, her arms uncrossed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk. Her gaze hadn't softened. It was sharp, searching, as if she was trying to peel back every layer of me. "But that's not the only reason I called you here tonight," she continued, her voice dipping just slightly. It was subtle but enough to make my breath catch. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that made my skin tingle. She took another step toward me and I fought the urge to retreat, even as my heart threatened to burst from my chest. "Tell me," she said, her voice softer now but no less commanding. "Have you ever felt something more between us?" The question hit me like a jolt of electricity. My breath caught and I could feel the heat rising in my chest, spreading up my neck and into my cheeks. I don't know what you mean, I stammered, though my voice betrayed me, trembling with the weight of the truth. Her lips curved into a knowing smile and she leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of my chair. The sudden closeness left me breathless, her face mere inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the faint sheen of gloss on her lips. I think you do, she said softly, her words a whisper that seemed to echo in the silence. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. All I could do was stare into her eyes, caught in the intensity of her gaze. My heart pounded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. And for the first time I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who had been pretending. Victoria gestured toward the chair in front of her desk, a subtle wave of her hand that somehow felt more like a command than an invitation. I hesitated for just a second before I stepped forward, sinking into the leather chair. The moment I sat down I could feel her eyes on me, sharp, assessing, as though she could see far beyond the surface of my composure. She didn't sit. Instead she stayed standing, one hand lightly gripping the edge of her desk while the other rested at her side. Her posture was impossibly poised, every movement deliberate, controlled. It made me feel unbalanced in contrast, my own nerves barely held together as I fidgeted with the hem of my skirt. Her lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that wasn't quite warm but wasn't unkind either. It was knowing, like she held the answer to a question I hadn't yet asked. I've been watching you, she began, her voice smooth and calm, every syllable measured. Your work, your dedication, it hasn't gone unnoticed. The compliment hit me with surprising force, leaving me momentarily stunned. My face grew hot, a blush creeping up my neck and blooming across my cheeks. I opened my mouth to respond, to say thank you, to acknowledge the praise with something appropriate. But the words tangled in my throat, and before I could untangle them, Victoria moved. The soft click of her heels against the polished floor echoed faintly as she took a step closer, her movements unhurried, almost predatory. My pulse quickened, an involuntary reaction to her presence. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms as she regarded me with an expression I couldn't quite read. But, she continued, her voice dipping slightly, that's not the only reason I asked you here tonight. Her words sent a shiver through me, a mixture of anticipation and something more primal. The room seemed to shrink as the air grew heavier, charged with a tension that pressed down on me like a weight. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I struggled to meet her gaze. Victoria stepped closer, her heels making barely a sound this time, as though she were intentionally softening her approach. When she stopped, she leaned forward, placing her hands on the arms of my chair. Her body hovered over mine, her face so close I could see the faintest hint of freckles dusting her cheeks, the sharp definition of her jawline illuminated by the warm glow of the desk lamp. Tell me, she said softly, her voice dropping to an almost intimate whisper. Have you ever felt like there's something more between us? The question hit me like a bolt of lightning, my breath catching in my throat. Her words lingered in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. My chest tightened, heat flooding up my neck and pooling in my cheeks. I tried to speak, but my voice cracked, betraying my nerves. Her gaze never wavered, her eyes locked on mine with a focus that made me feel both exposed and captivated. She tilted her head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that carried the full weight of her attention. Take your time, she murmured, her tone soft but laced with a quiet authority that made my pulse race even faster. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, a cacophony of doubt, desire, and the sheer gravity of the moment. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but the truth sat heavy on my tongue. I had felt it, the pull, the unspoken tension that had lingered in every shared glance, every fleeting moment between us. And now, with her so close, her words demanding an answer, I couldn't lie. I don't know, I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible. It was a cowardly response, one that didn't betray the full extent of my feelings, but it was all I could manage under the weight of her scrutiny. Her smile widened just slightly as if she saw straight through my hesitation. You don't know, she repeated, her tone somewhere between teasing and contemplative. Interesting. She pulled back slightly, but not enough to break the tension that hung between us. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the chair, a casual gesture that felt anything but casual in the charged silence of the room. Because I think you do, she said, her voice taking on a softer, more intimate quality. And I think you've felt it for a while now. I felt my body go rigid, my breath hitching as her words sank in. Was she right? Had she noticed the way I lingered just a little too long in her presence? The way I watched her from across the room when I thought she wasn't looking? My mind raced, the unspoken truth pressing against the walls I had carefully built around it. Before I could respond, she leaned in again, her proximity making my heart pound so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "It's okay," she said softly, her gaze dropping to my lips for the briefest moment before returning to my eyes. "You don't have to say anything." Her words were a lifeline, but they also left me on edge, teetering on the precipice of something I couldn't fully name. The heat between us was palpable now, an invisible thread that seemed to pull me closer to her even as I tried to keep my distance. She straightened slowly, her movements deliberate, calculated. "But I'll ask you again," she said, her tone steady, her eyes locking onto mine with a quiet intensity. "Have you ever felt like there's something more between us?" This time her words weren't a question. They were a challenge. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to bury the feelings that had been bubbling beneath the surface for so long, I knew I couldn't. Not anymore. The moments that followed unfolded in a blur of emotions I couldn't contain. Victoria stepped back, her composure unshaken, as though she held every ounce of control in the room. Meanwhile, I sat frozen, my mind a chaotic swirl of thoughts I couldn't quite pin down. My heart raced, my breathing shallow, and it felt like the walls of the room had drawn closer, wrapping me in a cocoon of tension I couldn't escape. She began to pace, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo my pounding pulse. Her movements were deliberate, her back straight, her chin held high. There wasn't a single crack in her armor. Her words, when they came, sliced through the silence like a blade. "I've seen the way you look at me," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. She glanced at me over her shoulder, her piercing gaze leaving no room for denial. "Don't think I haven't noticed." I opened my mouth to respond, to protest, to say something, anything, but the words failed me. How could I deny what was so painfully true? Of course I looked at her. How could I not? Victoria was magnetic, commanding, the kind of person who filled every room she entered with her presence alone. I had admired her for months, my gaze lingering just a little too long, my thoughts straying in ways they shouldn't. But I never thought she'd seen it. I had convinced myself I was invisible to her, just another cog in the machine. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unrelenting. Victoria turned to face me fully now, her hands resting on her hips as she studied me with a look that was equal parts frustration and something else. Something softer, more human. My heart twisted in my chest. "You think I wouldn't notice," she continued, her voice lower now, almost a murmur. "You think I don't feel it too?" The confession hit me like a punch to the gut. He felt it too? My breath caught, my chest tightening as I tried to process what she had just said. For months, I had convinced myself that whatever I felt was one-sided, a foolish infatuation I had no business indulging. And now here she was standing before me, pulling the rug out from under every assumption I had clung to. I started, my voice breaking. "I didn't think." Her lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "You didn't think I saw you?" she asked, her tone tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. Sadness? Amusement? "You didn't think I noticed the way your eyes lingered? The way you seemed to hang on my every word?" My cheeks burned with shame and something else, something dangerously close to exhilaration. She had noticed. Every stolen glance, every fleeting moment I had allowed myself to imagine something more. It wasn't all in my head. She stopped pacing, turning fully to face me again. This time when our eyes met, her expression was different. Gone was the cool, impenetrable mask she wore in meetings and at the head of the boardroom table. In its place was something raw, something vulnerable. Caught me off guard, stealing the breath from my lungs. "I don't mix work with personal feelings," she said, her voice quieter now, tinged with a hesitation I had never heard from her before. "I never have. It's messy, complicated, dangerous." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as her words hung in the air. I wanted to respond, to say something that would bridge the yawning gap between us, but I couldn't find my voice. "But with you," she paused, her eyes searching mine as though looking for an answer I didn't yet know how to give. "With you it's different. You're different." Her admission sent a jolt through me, a wave of heat spreading from my chest to the tips of my fingers. My hands gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles white as I struggled to ground myself. This was happening. This was real. My voice cracked again and I cleared my throat, forcing myself to look at her even as my heart threatened to betray me. You mean that? Victoria's lips quirked into a small smile, but this time it was softer, almost shy. You make me lose my head, she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. You have no idea how hard I've tried to ignore it. To pretend it wasn't there. I stared at her, my thoughts a chaotic mess of disbelief, longing and fear. Before I could even begin to process her words, she moved. In 2 steps, she had closed the distance between us, her presence overwhelming as she stood just inches away. Her hand reached out, tentative yet deliberate, her fingers brushing under my chin. The touch was gentle but firm, guiding me to look up at her. My breath hitched, my chest tight with anticipation as her gaze locked onto mine. And then without hesitation she leaned in. Her lips brushed against mine, soft and warm, and the world outside her office disappeared. The kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I felt myself melt into it, my hands moving instinctively to grip the edge of the chair for support as the kiss deepened. In that moment nothing else mattered. Not the risks, not the consequences, only the undeniable connection that had been simmering between us all along. Her breath mingled with mine, each exhale an unspoken promise, an electric pulse in the space between us. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it echoing in my chest, a chaotic rhythm that matched the heat in her gaze. Her hands, steady yet hesitant, cupped my face as the kiss deepened. It was more than just a kiss. It was an unraveling, a surrender, and I felt myself falling further into this moment. Her intent was clear, not in words but in the way her lips lingered, in the deliberate slide of her fingers as they traced the curve of my jaw. I couldn't think, I didn't want to. Instinct took over as I reached up, my fingers threading through the soft strands of her hair, pulling her closer. The subtle gasp that escaped her lips sent a shiver through me, and in that moment, all the careful restraint I'd held onto slipped away. She stepped back just enough to let her eyes roam over me, and I felt the weight of her gaze like a caress. Her expression was unreadable, half admiration, half hunger, and it left me breathless. Slowly, almost reverently, her fingers found the zipper of my dress, her movements unhurried but certain. I didn't stop her. I didn't want to. The fabric slipped away, pooling at my feet, leaving me exposed under the soft light of the room. Her eyes met mine then, and I saw the fire in them, the desire that mirrored my own. It was intoxicating, that look, the one that always left me weak, that made my pulse race and my skin tingle. She took a step closer, her hands steady as they brushed against my bare shoulders, then lower, finding the clasp of my bra. Her touch was confident, deliberate, yet her expression held a softness that made my heart ache in the best way. The tension between us built with every movement, every touch. When her hands found mine and guided them to her, it felt natural, inevitable, as if we'd been leading to this moment for far longer than either of us had realized. She was close, impossibly close, and the heat radiating from her skin seemed to set mine alight. With a gentle nudge, she lifted me onto the edge of her desk, her hands firm on my hips as if grounding me, anchoring me in the whirlwind of sensations. My legs wrapped around her instinctively, pulling her closer as her lips left a trail of kisses across my collarbone, down my chest and lower still. Each kiss felt like a spark, igniting something deep within me, a fire that burned without pain but left me utterly undone. I couldn't stop the soft gasps that escaped my lips, couldn't control the way my body arched toward her as though it had a will of its own. Every touch, every movement felt deliberate, as though she was mapping me, learning every response and savoring it. Her lips explored me with a precision that was equal parts maddening and exhilarating, and the sound of my own unsteady breathing filled the space between us. When she paused, her gaze lifting to meet mine, I saw something unexpected in her expression. A vulnerability that mirrored my own, as though this moment was as new and overwhelming for her as it was for me. It made my chest tighten, my heart swell, and I reached out, my fingers brushing against her cheek. She leaned into the touch for just a second before her focus returned, her determination evident in the way she moved, the way she guided me through a crescendo of sensations that left me breathless. The intensity built with every passing moment, every touch, every kiss. My head fell back, my hands gripping the edge of the desk as I let myself give in completely. It was overwhelming and electrifying, a symphony of feelings I didn't know my body was capable of. I felt myself unraveling, the world outside her office fading into insignificance, leaving only the two of us in this charged, infinite moment. And when her lips pressed against my skin once more, I couldn't hold back the shuddering sigh that escaped me. My thoughts scattered, replaced by pure sensation, and I realized with startling clarity that nothing would ever be the same after this. The night unfolded like a dream I never wanted to wake from, each moment vivid, etched into my memory with a clarity that left me breathless. Victoria's body pressed against mine, her warmth grounding me even as my mind spiraled in the aftermath of what we had shared. She was different now, more unguarded, her composure softened by a vulnerability I hadn't expected. Her laughter, low and melodic, filled the room as she teased me about the flush that refused to leave my cheeks. "You're so easy to read," she said, her tone playful but not unkind. "I didn't think I'd ever see you like this." I rolled my eyes, the gesture automatic, but the smile tugging at my lips betrayed me. "Don't get used to it," I muttered, though the lightness in my voice made the words feel less like a defense and more like an invitation. She leaned back, reaching into the bottom drawer of her desk with a smirk that promised mischief. When she straightened, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses were in her hands. I raised an eyebrow, my surprise evident. "Do you always keep wine in your office?" I asked, trying to suppress a laugh. "Only for special occasions," she replied smoothly, her smile widening. "And I think this qualifies." I couldn't argue with her logic. She poured the wine with the same precision she applied to everything, the deep red liquid catching the faint light as it swirled in the glasses. When she handed one to me, her fingers lingered just a moment too long against mine, and I felt the now familiar rush of heat that accompanied her touch. We sat together on the edge of her desk, the cool surface a stark contrast to the warmth radiating between us. The first sip of wine was rich and bold, its taste lingering on my tongue as Victoria turned to me, her expression suddenly serious. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I hesitated, the weight of her question settling over me. There was so much I could have said, how overwhelming this all felt, how terrified and exhilarated I was, how impossible it seemed that someone like her could look at me the way she did. But when I met her eyes, the honesty in them calmed the storm of thoughts swirling in my mind. "I'm thinking about how none of this feels real," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm going to wake up and it'll all be gone." Her gaze softened and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against my cheek. "It's real," she said firmly. "This is real." We fell into a conversation that was both heavy and light, words tumbling out in fits and starts as we navigated the uncharted territory we had entered. She spoke of boundaries, of the complications of what we had done, but there was no regret in her voice. Only caution, a determination to protect what we had stumbled into. "I don't regret this," she said finally, her tone steady. "But we have to be careful. You know that, don't you?" I nodded, my throat tight with unspoken words. "I know," I managed, though the thought of hiding, of navigating the precarious line we had crossed, left me feeling equal parts exhilarated and anxious. She walked me to the door, her hand brushing against the small of my back in a gesture so intimate it sent a shiver down my spine. The office felt different now, like it held a secret that belonged only to us. It was no longer just a place of work. It was a space marked by something deeper, something neither of us could undo. As we stood at the threshold, she paused, her fingers curling lightly around the edge of the doorframe. "But you don't regret it either, do you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, as though the question was as much for herself as it was for me. I shook my head, unable to find the words that could encapsulate everything I felt. Instead, I let the slight smile on my lips and the warmth in my gaze speak for me. Her own smile was soft, fleeting, but it held a vulnerability that made my chest ache. The days that followed were a test of restraint, every moment a delicate balance between the intensity of what we shared and the need to maintain a facade of normalcy. The stolen glances across the conference room, the fleeting brushes of hands when no one was looking, the cryptic texts that carried a weight only we understood. They were both a torment and a thrill, a reminder of the line we had crossed and the fire we couldn't extinguish. The tension was unbearable at times, the distance we were forced to maintain sharpening the ache of longing. But there was also a strange comfort in it, an intimacy in the secrecy that bound us together even when we were apart. And when the next invitation came, a simple message on my phone late one evening, her name lighting up the screen, I didn't hesitate. Standing outside her office door again, my heart racing with anticipation, I realized something with startling clarity. I didn't want to resist. Not now. Not ever.